When Major Thomas Grant ordered the quiet woman to strip in front of 300 elite soldiers, he thought he was exposing a fraud who didn't belong in their ranks. But when her jacket hit the desert sand and he saw the silver wolf tattoo etched between her shoulder blades, his face went white as death. What happened next would destroy careers, rewrite military protocols, and prove that the most dangerous warriors often hide in plain sight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Natasha Williams stood at the perimeter of Camp Thunder Ridge, watching elite candidates stumble through combat drills that seemed almost insultingly basic to her trained eye. At 28, she possessed the kind of understated presence that made people look right through her. Medium height, athletic but not imposing, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail and not a trace of makeup on her angular face. Her standard-issue training fatigues hung loosely on her lean frame, and the bright orange civilian contractor badge on her chest might as well have been a neon sign advertising her outsider status. For 4 weeks now, she'd been the phantom of the Montana training facility. While other candidates barked orders and flexed their credentials, Natasha observed in silence. While they competed for instructor attention and compared their impressive resumes, she kept her background locked away like classified intelligence. Her fellow trainees had started calling her Ghost behind her back, not because she was skilled, but because she seemed to drift through the program without making any real impact. This wasn't just any military installation. Camp Thunder Ridge housed the Inter-Service Elite Development Program, where only the most exceptional candidates were selected to bridge special operations across all branches of the armed forces. Every person here had earned their spot through distinguished combat records, advanced tactical degrees, or exceptional performance in previous elite units. Former Navy SEALs trained alongside Army Rangers. Marine Force recon operators shared barracks with Air Force pararescue specialists. The competition was fierce, the standards impossible, and the failure rate deliberately high. But Natasha had simply appeared one Tuesday morning with paperwork that raised more questions than it answered. Her orders came from so high up the chain of command that even the base commander seemed uncertain about her purpose. She carried herself with quiet confidence, but never volunteered information about her background. When asked direct questions about her experience, she gave minimal answers that satisfied nobody. During field exercises, she performed adequately but never exceptionally. She completed obstacle courses within acceptable time limits, maintained her weapon properly, and followed orders without complaint. But there was something about her movements, too smooth, too economical, like someone consciously holding back their true capabilities. The instructors noticed it too. They would watch her with puzzled expressions, sensing something beneath the surface, but unable to identify what it was. The whispers had started almost immediately. A group of seasoned operators would huddle together during breaks, stealing glances in her direction while speculating about her connections. Sergeant Olivia Parker, a decorated combat veteran with perfectly maintained gear and an attitude to match, made no effort to hide her disdain. "Daddy's little princess," she would mutter loud enough for others to hear. Probably some general's daughter getting a tour of military life before she goes back to her desk job. Corporal Ryan Davis, built like a linebacker and covered in tattoos. Chronicling his deployments was even less charitable. "This is supposed to be elite training," he complained to anyone who would listen. "We're preparing for operations that could determine national security outcomes. And they bring in some corporate consultant who looks like she belongs in a boardroom, not a battlefield." Private Lauren Murphy, young and eager to prove herself among the veterans, had taken to openly mocking Natasha's quiet demeanor. "Watch this," she would say before deliberately bumping into Natasha during formation or accidentally taking her assigned equipment. Each small provocation was designed to get a reaction, to prove that the mysterious civilian couldn't handle real military pressure. But Natasha never responded to the harassment. She would simply adjust her position, retrieve her gear, and continue with whatever task was at hand. Her face remained neutral, her breathing steady, her focus unshakable. The lack of reaction only frustrated her tormentors more, making them believe she was either too naive to understand she was being targeted or too weak to defend herself. What none of them knew was that Natasha had faced far worse than playground bullying. 3 years ago, she had been part of something that officially never existed. Operation Silent Thunder had been a joint special operations mission so classified that even mentioning its name could result in federal charges. The mission parameters were simple: infiltrate a terrorist compound, extract high-value intelligence, and eliminate all traces of the operation. 7 of the military's most elite operators had been selected for Silent Thunder. They trained together for months, developing the kind of seamless coordination that comes only from absolute trust and shared sacrifice. Natasha had been the team's intelligence specialist, responsible for navigation, communications, and tactical analysis. But when everything went wrong in the mountains of Afghanistan, those specialized skills had been the only thing standing between total mission failure and catastrophic loss of life. The ambush had come from 3 directions simultaneously. Enemy forces had been waiting, armed with intelligence that suggested a security breach somewhere in the command structure. Within minutes, Natasha watched 5 of her teammates fall to coordinated sniper fire. The extraction point was compromised, communications were jammed, and enemy reinforcements were closing in from all sides. She had 2 choices: attempt to carry out the wounded and guarantee that everyone would die, or complete the mission alone and ensure that their sacrifice meant something. She chose the mission. For 18 hours she moved through enemy territory like a ghost, avoiding patrols, disabling communications equipment, and gathering the intelligence that would save thousands of lives. When she finally reached the alternate extraction point, she was carrying classified materials that would prevent 3 separate terrorist attacks on American soil. But she was also carrying the weight of being the only survivor, the one who had to explain to 5 families why their loved ones weren't coming home. The official report classified Operation Silent Thunder as a training accident. The families received folded flags and vague explanations about classified operations that served the greater good. Natasha received a tattoo that she designed herself, a silver wolf howling at a crescent moon, surrounded by 6 lightning bolts representing her fallen teammates, the ghost wolves they had called themselves. Now she was the only wolf left. The tattoo was hidden beneath her regulation uniform, invisible to the candidates who dismissed her as weak. But every morning when she dressed, she felt its weight against her skin. Every night when she undressed, she saw their faces in the mirror. The quiet woman who seemed so unremarkable was carrying secrets that could reshape military doctrine and honoring memories that officially didn't exist. As Natasha stood watching another routine training exercise, she had no idea that everything was about to change. Major Thomas Grant was approaching from across the compound, his jaw set with the kind of determination that suggested he'd finally decided to address what he saw as a problem. Behind him, a small crowd was beginning to gather, instructors and candidates drawn by the promise of confrontation. The desert sun was climbing toward its brutal midday peak, and the temperature was already approaching dangerous levels. Perfect conditions for the kind of public spectacle that would either break someone completely or reveal what they were truly made of. Natasha adjusted her gear one final time, her movements calm and purposeful, completely unaware that within the next hour, her carefully maintained anonymity would be shattered forever. The ghost wolf's tattoo remained hidden beneath her uniform. But its time in shadow was about to end. And when it was finally revealed, it would change everything for everyone watching. Major Thomas Grant had been watching Natasha Williams for 3 weeks, and every day his frustration grew stronger. At 34, Grant had built his career on identifying weakness before it could compromise mission effectiveness. He'd served 2 tours, in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, and had personally recommended the dismissal of 17 candidates who couldn't meet the standards of elite military service. His record was spotless, his instincts sharp, and his patience for pretenders non-existent. From his office window, overlooking the training grounds, Grant could see Natasha going through her morning equipment check with the same methodical precision. She brought to everything. Too methodical, he thought. Real soldiers developed natural rhythms born from muscle memory and battlefield experience. Her movements looked rehearsed, like someone following a checklist rather than operating from instinct. "Sir?" Captain Jennifer Logan knocked on his open door, carrying a stack of evaluation reports. Logan was one of the few instructors Grant trusted completely, a former Army Ranger with commendations from 3 combat deployments and an eye for talent that had identified some of the program's most successful graduates. "What's your assessment of the civilian contractor?" Grant asked without turning from the window. Logan hesitated, which was unusual for her. She was known for quick, decisive evaluations that cut straight to the core of a candidate's capabilities. "She's difficult to read, sir. Her performance metrics are solid across all categories, but there's something I can't put my finger on." "Elaborate." "Yesterday during the urban warfare simulation, she made tactical decisions that were textbook perfect. But they weren't the kind of solutions you learn from manuals, sir. They were the kind that come from experience." Logan paused, studying her notes. When Martinez's team got pinned down by simulated sniper fire, Williams identified the shooters, positioned within seconds, and directed a flanking maneuver that resolved the situation with 0 casualties. Grant finally turned from the window. "And the problem with that is?" "The problem is that she did it without using any of the standard communication protocols. She used hand signals that aren't taught in any current military curriculum. Old signals. Special operations signals that have been phased out for security reasons." Logan met his eyes. "Sir, either she's had training that's not reflected in her file, or she's had field experience that she's not disclosing." This confirmed Grant's suspicions, but not in the way he'd expected. He'd assumed Williams was underqualified, a political appointment who would fold under real pressure. But Logan's assessment suggested something more troubling, that Williams was hiding her true capabilities, which meant she was hiding her true background. "Have you run a deeper background check?" Grant asked. "I've tried, sir. Her clearance comes from so high up that most of her file is redacted. What I can access shows basic civilian contractor credentials, some private security work, and a few years in corporate consulting. But the dates don't add up, and there are gaps in her employment history that aren't explained." Grant nodded grimly. Gap-filled resumes and overclassified files usually meant one of 2 things. Either someone was hiding their lack of qualifications, or they were hiding qualifications so sensitive that standard disclosure would compromise national security. Given Williams's performance, he was beginning to suspect the latter, which made her presence even more problematic. "Sir," Logan continued, "if she's here under some kind of classified status, shouldn't we have been briefed? The other candidates are starting to ask questions, and frankly, so are the instructors." That was another problem Grant had been monitoring. The whispers about Williams were growing louder and more resentful. This morning, he'd overheard Sergeant Parker organizing what she called a reality check for the civilian contractor. Corporal Davis had been openly discussing ways to test her limits during the next combat exercise. Private Murphy was encouraging others to make Williams feel unwelcome enough to quit voluntarily. Under normal circumstances, Grant would have shut down such behavior immediately. Military discipline demanded respect for chain of command and professional courtesy regardless of personal opinions. But Williams occupied a unique position. She wasn't officially military, so standard protections didn't fully apply, yet her clearance level suggested she couldn't be dismissed casually. "The candidates are right to be concerned," Grant said finally. "This program exists to train the next generation of elite operators. If Williams is here under false pretenses, she represents a security risk and a training liability. If she's here legitimately, then her secrecy is undermining unit cohesion and trust." Logan nodded. "What do you want me to do, sir?" Grant considered his options. He could request clarification from higher command, but that would take weeks and might result in no additional information. He could transfer Williams to a different program, but that would look like he couldn't handle personnel management within his own facility. Or he could create a situation that would force Williams to reveal her true capabilities, one way or another. "Schedule a comprehensive field evaluation for this afternoon," Grant decided. "Full combat simulation, maximum stress. Protocols. If Williams is what she appears to be, she'll struggle and will have grounds for dismissal. If she's more than she appears to be, the pressure will force her to show her true colors." "Sir, that's aggressive. Those protocols are designed to push experienced operators to their limits. If Williams really is just a civilian contractor, then she learned quickly that this isn't the place for her." Grant's voice carried the finality of command decision. "Either way, we'll have our answer by the end of the day." As Logan left to arrange the evaluation, Grant returned to his window. Williams was now working with a group of candidates on equipment maintenance, moving between them with quiet efficiency. She never dominated conversations, never pushed her opinions forward, never drew attention to herself. But Grant noticed that the candidates who worked with her directly seemed to perform better afterward, as if her quiet competence was somehow contagious. That it was maddening. Everything about her suggested depth and capability, but she refused to claim credit or demonstrate her skills openly. She acted like someone who had nothing to prove, which in Grant's experience meant either supreme confidence or dangerous delusion. Across the compound, Williams looked up from her work and made brief eye contact with Grant through his office window. There was no challenge in her gaze, no defiance or fear. Just acknowledgement, the look of someone who knew they were being watched and accepted it as part of their environment. Then she returned to her task, leaving Grant with the uncomfortable feeling that he was the one being evaluated. The afternoon's field exercise would change everything. Grant was certain of that. What he didn't realize was how completely it would change his own understanding of who Natasha Williams really was, and why her presence at Camp Thunder Ridge was about to become the most important thing that had ever happened to his career. The temperature was climbing toward dangerous levels, and the desert heat would add another layer of stress to an already intense situation. Perfect conditions for the kind of revelation that would either expose a fraud or unveil a legend. Grant had no idea he was about to discover which one Natasha Williams truly was. The mess hall buzzed with an undercurrent of tension that had been building for weeks. Lunch conversations that normally focused on training scores and weekend plans now centered around one topic: the mysterious civilian contractor who didn't belong. Natasha sat alone at a corner table, methodically eating her meal while pretending not to notice the clusters of candidates who kept glancing in her direction. Sergeant Olivia Parker had positioned herself at the center table where her voice would carry to the maximum number of listeners. With her pristine uniform and carefully applied makeup that somehow survived the brutal desert conditions, Parker commanded attention wherever she went. She'd served 3 tours as a combat medic, saved dozens of lives under fire, and earned her place in the program through demonstrated excellence. That pedigree gave weight to her opinions, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. "I'm just saying," Parker announced, cutting her sandwich with military precision. "We all had to prove ourselves to get here. Combat records, fitness evaluations, psychological assessments, recommendation letters from commanding officers. We earned our spots. She gestured toward Natasha without bothering to lower her voice. But somehow she just appeared with paperwork. Nobody can explain. Corporal Ryan Davis nodded vigorously, his heavily tattooed arms crossed over his chest. Each tattoo told a story of deployment, service, and sacrifice, visual proof of his military credentials. My squad leader died getting me the recommendation that brought me here, he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine loss. Took shrapnel meant for me, bled out in my arms, but made sure I had the documentation to continue my career. And they're telling me that means the same as whatever strings somebody pulled for her. Private Lauren Murphy, the youngest member of their informal alliance, leaned forward conspiratorially. I heard from someone in administration that her file requires clearance levels above base commander authority. What civilian contractor needs that kind of security classification? Unless she's not really civilian at all. The speculation was becoming more creative and more dangerous with each retelling. Some candidates theorized that Natasha was an undercover inspector sent to evaluate the program for potential closure. Others suggested she was a foreign agent using fake credentials to infiltrate American military training. The most popular theory was that she was connected to a defense contractor, gathering intelligence for private military companies that might compete with military operations. Staff Sergeant Antonio Reyes, a decorated Special Forces veteran with more combat experience than most officers, had been listening to the conversation with growing discomfort. Unlike the others, he'd actually worked with Natasha during several exercises, and what he'd observed didn't match the narrative his colleagues were building. You know, Reyes said quietly, maybe we should focus on our own training instead of creating conspiracy theories about someone who's never done anything to any of us. Parker's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose. Never done anything? Sergeant, she's taking a slot that could have gone to a qualified operator. Every day she stays here is a day that someone deserving gets passed over. Based on what evidence? Reyes challenged. Her performance scores are solid. She follows orders, completes assignments, doesn't cause problems. What exactly is she doing wrong besides existing in a way that makes you uncomfortable? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Davis shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. She doesn't belong here, and everyone knows it. Look at her. He gestured toward Natasha, who was reading a technical manual while eating. Does that look like someone who belongs in elite military training? Does she look like someone you'd want watching your back in combat? What Davis couldn't see from his angle was the manual Natasha was reading. It was an advanced tactical communications guide filled with protocols and procedures that wouldn't be covered in their curriculum for another 6 weeks. She was absorbing the information with the kind of focused attention that suggested it wasn't entirely new to her, making notes in margins and cross-referencing different sections with practiced efficiency. Murphy giggled, a sound that seemed particularly harsh in the military environment. I bet she's never even been in a real fight. Probably faints at the sight of blood. Tomorrow's field exercise is going to be brutal. Major Grant specifically said maximum stress protocols. She'd probably wash out before lunch. Good, Parker said with satisfaction. This program is about preparing for real-world operations, where people's lives depend on everyone being qualified. If she can't handle the pressure, better to find out here than in the field where her weakness could get people killed. Across the mess hall, Captain Derek Sullivan was having his own conversation with fellow instructors. Sullivan had 20 years of experience, including classified operations that he couldn't discuss even with his colleagues. Unlike Grant, who saw Natasha as a problem to be solved, Sullivan saw her as a puzzle to be understood. There's something about Williams that doesn't add up, he told Staff Sergeant Maya Patel as they reviewed afternoon training schedules. Grant thinks she's hiding incompetence, but I think she's hiding the opposite. Patel nodded thoughtfully. She'd been observing Natasha during weapons training and noticed details that others missed. Her weapon handling is interesting. Technically correct, but there are small variations in her grip and stance that suggest training from multiple disciplines. Military training creates consistency. Everyone learns the same way. But Williams shows influences from different schools of combat. Instruction. Exactly. And yesterday during the navigation exercise, she identified landmarks using terminology that's not in our current training materials. Old terms, specialized terms that most people wouldn't know unless they'd worked with units that use them operationally. Sullivan paused, considering his next words carefully. Maya, what if Williams isn't here as a student? What if she's here as something else entirely? Before Patel could respond, the mess hall's atmosphere shifted dramatically. Major Grant had entered, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone present. But he wasn't alone. Behind him walked General William Carter, the base commander whose authority extended far beyond Camp Thunder Ridge. Carter's unexpected appearance sent a ripple of nervous energy through the room. Grant's eyes swept the mess hall and locked onto Natasha, who had looked up from her manual and was watching the two officers with calm attention. There was no surprise in her expression, no nervousness at seeing the base commander. If anything, she looked like someone who had been expecting this moment. Attention! Grant called out, and every person in the mess hall snapped to their feet in perfect synchronization. Everyone except Natasha, who rose more slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate rather than reflexive. Grant noticed the difference immediately, and his jaw tightened with irritation. Another small act of defiance, another sign that Williams didn't understand or respect military protocol. What he didn't realize was that Natasha's measured response came from years of training where instant reactions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She was assessing the situation, reading body language and positioning, gathering information that would help her understand what was about to happen. This afternoon's field exercise has been modified, Grant announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Maximum stress protocols will be implemented. Any candidate who cannot maintain performance standards under extreme pressure will be immediately dismissed from the program. His eyes remained fixed on Natasha as he spoke. The message was clear. This was directed at her, designed to expose her limitations and justify her removal. Around the room, candidates exchanged nervous glances. Maximum stress protocols were legendary at Camp Thunder Ridge simulations, so intense that even experienced operators sometimes failed to complete them successfully. But Natasha's expression didn't change. She simply nodded acknowledgement, as if Grant had announced a routine schedule adjustment rather than what amounted to a public challenge. Her calm reaction seemed to infuriate Grant even more, confirming his belief that she didn't understand the seriousness of what she was facing. What Grant couldn't know was that Natasha had faced tests far more demanding than anything Camp Thunder Ridge could devise. The afternoon's exercise would indeed reveal the truth about who she was, but not in the way he expected. The ghost wolf's tattoo hidden beneath her uniform carried memories of challenges that made military training simulations seem like gentle preparation for the real battles that lay ahead. The storm was about to break, and everyone in the mess hall could feel the electricity building in the air. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly across the training field as 300 candidates assembled for what would become the most talked-about exercise in Camp Thunder Ridge history. The desert heat created shimmering mirages on the horizon, and the temperature had climbed past 110 degrees, conditions that would test human endurance, even without the additional stress of combat simulation. Major Grant stood at the center of the field, his uniform crisp despite the brutal conditions. Behind him, a complex obstacle course had been constructed overnight. Urban warfare mock-ups, rappelling towers, live-fire ranges, and psychological pressure stations designed to break even experienced operators. This wasn't standard training. This was an elimination gauntlet that would separate the truly elite from those who merely thought they belonged. Natasha took her position in the formation with the same quiet composure she brought to everything. Around her, seasoned veterans were showing signs of nervousness. Sweat beaded on foreheads, hands flexed unconsciously, and conversations died as the reality of the situation sank in. Maximum stress protocols had a legendary reputation because they pushed candidates beyond their perceived limits, forcing them to either discover inner strength they didn't know they possessed or confront weaknesses they couldn't overcome. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grant began, his voice carrying across the field with military precision, "today's exercise will determine who among you has earned the right to continue in this program. You will face scenarios designed to test not just your physical capabilities, but your mental resilience, tactical judgment, and ability to perform under pressure that simulates real combat conditions." He began pacing in front of the formation, his eyes systematically scanning the ranks. When his gaze reached Natasha, it lingered with unmistakable intent. Several candidates noticed the pointed attention, and whispers began to ripple through the formation despite the call for silence. "Some of you may be wondering why these protocols have been implemented," Grant continued, his voice taking on sharper edge. "The answer is simple. This program exists to train operators who will face life-and-death situations where failure means not just personal consequences, but the potential loss of American lives. We cannot afford to graduate anyone who hasn't proven themselves capable of handling extreme pressure." Grant stopped directly in front of Natasha, close enough that she could see the calculation in his eyes. "Which brings me to a specific concern that has been brought to my attention. It seems we have a candidate whose qualifications and background remain unclear. Someone who has been participating in elite military training without providing transparent evidence of their fitness for such responsibility." The field went dead quiet. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath as 300 pairs of eyes turned toward Natasha. She stood at perfect attention, her face showing no reaction to Grant's public accusation. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged. Her eyes focused on a point just over his shoulder in classic military bearing. But inside, Natasha was processing multiple layers of information. Grant's body language suggested this was personal rather than professional. His shoulders were tight with frustration, his jaw clenched with the kind of anger that came from feeling challenged by someone he considered inferior. The formation around her was shifting subtly, creating psychological distance as candidates unconsciously separated themselves from what they sensed was about to become a public execution. "Contractor Williams," Grant said, using her civilian designation like a weapon, "please step forward." Natasha moved with fluid precision, her boots silent on the desert sand despite the speed of her approach. When she reached Grant's position, she stopped exactly 3 feet away and assumed a position of attention with movements so economical they seemed effortless. Her response was textbook perfect, yet somehow it irritated Grant even more. "Tell me, Williams," Grant said, beginning to circle her like a predator evaluating prey. "What makes you think you belong here among these decorated veterans and elite operators? What gives you the right to wear that uniform and participate in training designed for America's finest warriors?" The question hung in the desert air like a physical presence. Camera phones appeared discreetly as candidates positioned themselves to record what was clearly going to be a memorable confrontation. This wasn't standard military discipline. This was public humiliation designed to break someone who Grant had decided didn't belong. Natasha remained silent, which seemed to infuriate Grant further. He was accustomed to getting reactions, to seeing people crack under pressure or at least attempt to defend themselves. But Natasha absorbed his words like they were background noise, her calm unnatural and unsettling. "I asked you a question, Contractor," Grant pressed, his voice rising to ensure everyone could hear. These men and women have earned their places. Through years of distinguished service, combat deployments, and proven excellence, they've sacrificed for their country, bled for their fellow soldiers, and demonstrated the kind of courage that defines true warriors. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his aftershave mixed with desert dust. But you just appeared one day with paperwork that nobody can verify, and now you think you deserve to stand among heroes. So I'm asking you again, what exactly have you done to earn that right? Still, Natasha said nothing. Her silence was maddening. To Grant, who had expected either defensive explanations or at least signs of discomfort. Instead, she stood there like a statue, absorbing his verbal assault with a composure that suggested either supreme confidence or complete disconnection from reality. That's when Grant decided to escalate beyond acceptable military protocol. The heat, the pressure of command, and his growing frustration with Natasha's unflappable demeanor combined to push him past the line of professional conduct. "You know what, Williams?" Grant said, stepping back so the entire formation could see both of them clearly. "I don't think you've earned the right to wear that uniform at all. In fact, I think you need to remove it right now, right here, in front of everyone who actually belongs on this field." A collective intake of breath swept through the formation. Even the most hardened veterans looked shocked at Grant's demand. This crossed every line of military decency and professionalism. Several instructors exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly uncertain whether they should intervene in what was becoming a personal vendetta rather than legitimate military discipline. Natasha felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. Could sense phones being raised to capture what everyone expected to be her moment of ultimate humiliation. This would be talked about for years, the day the mysterious civilian contractor was stripped of her dignity in front of the entire training facility. But something unexpected happened. Instead of protesting, instead of looking around for someone to intervene, instead of showing any sign of the shame and embarrassment Grant was trying to inflict, Natasha reached for the zipper of her outer training jacket with hands that remained perfectly steady. The sound of the zipper seemed impossibly loud in the desert silence. Metal teeth separated with a soft whisper that carried across the field like thunder. Natasha shrugged the jacket off her shoulders and let it fall to the sand at her feet, revealing the plain black tank top she wore underneath. Her arms were lean but defined, marked with small scars that could have come from training accidents or something far more serious. But it wasn't her arms that caught everyone's attention as she turned slightly in the desert heat. It was what was about to become visible between her shoulder blades, a tattoo that would change everything for everyone watching. The silver wolf began to emerge as the tank top shifted, its howling form etched in intricate detail against her skin. Around it, 6 lightning bolts radiated outward in a pattern that looked random to most observers, but would be immediately recognizable to anyone who had ever worked in classified special operations. Grant's mouth opened to continue his verbal assault, but the words died in his throat as he saw what Natasha had been hiding beneath her unremarkable exterior. The Ghost Wolf's insignia wasn't just a tattoo. It was a declaration of service so classified that most people would never know it existed, and so elite that those who did would never forget what it meant. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. 300 elite military candidates, instructors with decades of experience, and support staff all stood frozen as the full scope of Natasha's tattoo became visible in the harsh desert sunlight. The silver wolf, howling at a crescent moon, dominated the space between her shoulder blades, its intricate details catching the light with an almost ethereal quality. The 6 lightning bolts radiating outward weren't random decorative elements. They formed a precise pattern that only those with the highest security clearances would recognize. Major Grant's face underwent a transformation that was visible to everyone watching. The color drained from his features, leaving him pale despite the brutal desert heat. His mouth remained open, but no sound emerged. His eyes, which moments before had been filled with righteous anger and conviction, now showed something approaching. Horror as the implications of what he was seeing began to sink in. The Ghost Wolf's insignia was legendary in certain circles, whispered about in secure briefing rooms, referenced in documents that required clearance levels most career military personnel would never achieve. It represented membership in an elite unit so classified that officially it had never existed. The kind of group that handled operations too sensitive for conventional special forces, missions that required not just exceptional skill but absolute deniability. Sergeant Olivia Parker, who had been standing near the front of the formation, expecting to witness Natasha's humiliation, felt her knees go weak. She recognized the tattoo from a classified briefing she'd attended 2 years earlier, a presentation about threat assessment that had included a single slide, showing various insignia of friendly forces that field operatives might encounter. The Ghost Wolf's emblem had been displayed for exactly 30 seconds, accompanied by the instruction that anyone bearing this mark was to be treated with highest priority and complete cooperation. Corporal Ryan Davis, whose own tattoos chronicled years of conventional military service, stared at Natasha's back with dawning comprehension. He'd heard stories about the Ghost Wolves during his deployments, fragments of conversations between officers who thought enlisted personnel weren't listening, references to operations that had saved thousands of lives but would never appear in any official record. He'd always assumed they were military legends, stories told to maintain morale and mystique around special operations. But here was proof that the legends were real, etched into the skin of a woman he'd dismissed as weak and unqualified. Private Lauren Murphy, the youngest member of the group that had spent weeks mocking Natasha, felt sick to her stomach. The woman she'd accidentally bumped into, whose equipment she'd deliberately taken, whose competence she'd openly questioned, was a member of the most elite military unit in American history. Every slight, every snide comment, every act of casual disrespect now seemed not just inappropriate, but potentially career-ending. Captain Derek Sullivan, who had been observing from the instructor area, stepped forward involuntarily. Unlike the candidates, he had actually worked with operations that interfaced with Ghost Wolves personnel, though always at arm's length and with minimal information sharing. He knew that members of this unit carried authority that superseded normal military hierarchy, operated under protocols that didn't appear in any standard manual, and reported directly to levels of command that most officers would never encounter. But it was Staff Sergeant Antonio Reyes who broke the paralyzed silence. As the formation's most experienced special operations veteran, he was the first to process what everyone was seeing and understand its full implications. "Holy shit," he whispered, just loud enough for those near him to hear. "She's a Ghost Wolf." The whisper rippled through the formation like wildfire. Candidates who had never heard the term began asking hurried questions of those who had. Instructors were pulling out phones to make urgent calls to superiors who needed to be informed immediately. The entire dynamic of the training facility was shifting in real time as people realized that their understanding of Natasha Williams had been catastrophically wrong. Natasha herself remained perfectly still, allowing everyone to see and process what she had revealed. Her breathing was steady, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral. She had known this moment would come eventually. Her cover had been too thin to maintain indefinitely, and Grant's public challenge had simply accelerated the inevitable timeline. But she felt no satisfaction in the shock and horror spreading through the formation. The Ghost Wolves tattoo wasn't a trophy or a symbol of personal achievement. It was a memorial to 5 teammates who hadn't made it home, a permanent reminder of the price of the mission they had completed together. Each lightning bolt represented a life lost, a family destroyed, a sacrifice that could never be publicly acknowledged. The sound of approaching vehicles broke through the stunned silence. Official cars were racing across the desert toward the training field, their engines straining against the heat and terrain. Someone with significant authority had been monitoring the situation and was responding with emergency speed. Major Grant finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. I didn't know. Your file didn't indicate ... My file shows exactly what it's supposed to show, Natasha said quietly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. Her voice carried across the silent field without effort, calm and professional, despite the chaos she had just unleashed. Classification protocols exist for operational security reasons that extend far beyond individual career concerns. She turned to face Grant directly, and for the first time, he saw her eyes without the careful neutrality she had maintained for weeks. They held depths of experience that no amount of conventional military training could create, the look of someone who had seen things that officially never happened and made decisions that would haunt them forever. The question now, Major, Natasha continued, is whether you're prepared to deal with the consequences of forcing a classified operative to reveal their status in front of 300 witnesses with recording devices. Grant's complexion went from pale to gray. Forcing the disclosure of classified information, even inadvertently, was a federal offense that could end not just his military career, but potentially result in criminal charges. The fact that he had done so through what amounted to public humiliation of a decorated operative made the situation exponentially worse. The approaching vehicles had reached the training field, and figures in dress uniforms were stepping out, with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested serious official business. Radio chatter was crackling across multiple frequencies as word of the situation spread up the chain of command at light speed. Natasha watched the controlled chaos developing around her with professional detachment. She had spent 3 years living quietly with the weight of Operation Silent Thunder, honoring her fallen teammates through anonymous service and trying to build something positive from the ashes of their sacrifice. But that chapter of her life was now over, ended by a confrontation that should never have happened. The ghost wolves were about to emerge from the shadows, and everyone who had witnessed their reveal was about to learn that some legends were far more real and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. As the official vehicles disgorged their passengers and began moving toward the formation, Natasha allowed herself one small moment of anticipation. Major Grant had wanted to expose what he saw as weakness and deception. Instead, he was about to discover that he had just awakened something that had been sleeping peacefully, and that some sleeping things were far better left undisturbed. Desert heat continued to beat down mercilessly, but the temperature on the training field was about to get much, much hotter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. General William Carter stepped out of the lead vehicle with the kind of controlled urgency that comes from 30 years of military command. At 58, Carter was a man who had seen everything the modern military had to offer: 3 wars, countless classified operations, and political situations that required diplomatic precision combined with unwavering strength. But as he strode across the desert sand toward the frozen formation, his expression showed something rarely seen on his weathered features: genuine concern mixed with barely contained anger. Behind Carter came a contingent of officers whose presence immediately elevated the situation beyond routine base management. Colonel Patricia Hayes from Pentagon Special Operations Command, her dress uniform pristine despite the emergency response. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson from Military Intelligence, carrying a briefcase that undoubtedly contained documents most people on the field would never be cleared to see. And finally, Captain Sarah Mitchell from the Judge Advocate General's office, the military's equivalent of bringing a lawyer to what had started as a training exercise. The formation of candidates remained frozen in place, unsure whether they should maintain attention or disperse. Most had never seen this level of command authority assembled in one place, and the implications were becoming clearer with each passing moment. This wasn't just about a training dispute anymore. This was about potential breaches of national security protocols at the highest levels. Major Grant stood isolated between the advancing officers and the revealed operative, his career hanging in the balance like a man caught between moving vehicles. Sweat that had nothing to do with the desert heat beaded on his forehead as he processed the magnitude of his mistake. In his zeal to expose what he saw as a security risk, he had forced the public disclosure of information so classified that its revelation could compromise ongoing operations around the world. General Carter's voice, when he finally spoke, carried across the training field with the authority of absolute command. Major Grant. The two words contained volumes of disappointment, anger, and professional judgment. Carter stopped 10 feet away from Grant, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough to maintain the formality that serious military discipline required. "Sir," Grant managed, his voice barely steady enough to be considered professional. "Major, I want you to explain to me, in front of these witnesses, since you seem to prefer public forums for sensitive discussions, exactly what authority you believe you possess to order a Ghost Wolves operative to reveal classified information." The question landed like a physical blow. Grant's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, his brain struggling to process information that reconfigured everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy and his own position within it. Ghost Wolves operatives didn't just outrank him. They operated in an entirely different structure of command that bypassed normal military protocols entirely. Colonel Hayes stepped forward, her voice crisp with professional precision. "Major Grant, are you familiar with Section 847 of the National Defense Authorization Act, specifically the provisions regarding special operations personnel operating under deep classification protocols?" Grant shook his head, unable to find his voice. The legal framework governing classified operations was deliberately compartmentalized. Most officers never encountered it because they never needed to know it existed. But ignorance of specialized military law wasn't a defense when that ignorance led to potential security breaches. Section 847, Hayes continued relentlessly, explicitly states that personnel operating under Ghost Wolves classification carry authority equivalent to field-grade officers, regardless of their apparent rank or status. Furthermore, any attempt to compromise their operational security through forced disclosure constitutes a federal offense under both military and civilian law. The weight of Hayes's words settled over the training field like a suffocating blanket. Grant was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a career-ending mistake. It was potentially a criminal offense that could result in federal prosecution, imprisonment, and the complete destruction of everything he had worked to build. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson opened his briefcase and withdrew a tablet computer, his fingers moving quickly across its surface. "Major Grant, I'm showing here that Operative Williams has been assigned to this facility under direct orders from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Her mission parameters are classified above your clearance level, but I can tell you that her presence here serves national security interests that extend far beyond routine training evaluation." Natasha, who had remained silent throughout the official response, finally spoke again. Her voice remained calm and professional, but now it carried an undertone of authority that made everyone on the field unconsciously straighten their posture. "General Carter," she said, addressing the base commander directly, with respect, "the operational security compromise created by this situation extends beyond individual disciplinary concerns. 300 personnel with varying clearance levels have now been exposed to classified information that could affect ongoing missions if improperly disclosed." Carter nodded grimly. Natasha was right. The ripple effects of Grant's public challenge would require extensive damage control measures. Every person who witnessed the Ghost Wolves insignia would need to be debriefed, reminded of their security obligations, and monitored to ensure that sensitive information didn't leak beyond the training facility. Operative Williams, Carter, said, using her proper designation for the first time, "What are your recommendations for containment protocols?" The question itself was significant. By asking for Natasha's professional assessment, Carter was publicly acknowledging her authority and expertise in ways that completely inverted the power dynamic that had existed moments before. The woman who had been ordered to strip by a superior officer was now being consulted by the base commander on matters of national security. "Sir," Natasha replied, "I recommend immediate implementation of Information Security Protocol 7 for all personnel present. Non-disclosure agreements will need to be updated to include specific language regarding today's events. Additionally, any photographic or video evidence captured during the incident should be confiscated and secured according to classified material handling procedures." Around the formation, candidates who had been discreetly recording the confrontation suddenly found themselves looking at their phones with new understanding. What they had intended to capture as entertainment or evidence of harassment was now classified material that could land them in federal prison if mishandled. Captain Mitchell stepped forward, her legal training evident in the precision of her words. "Major Grant, you are hereby relieved of command pending a full investigation into potential violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, federal security statutes, and international operational security agreements. You will surrender your access credentials, weapons, and command authority immediately." The formal language of military justice proceedings had a ritualistic quality that made Grant's downfall seem inevitable and complete. In the space of 15 minutes, he had gone from confident command authority to facing potential court-martial and federal prosecution. But the most devastating moment came when Natasha walked over to where her training jacket lay in the desert sand. As she bent to retrieve it, the full scope of her tattoo became visible one final time: the silver wolf, the crescent moon, and the 6 lightning bolts that represented teammates who had died in service to operations that Grant would never have the clearance to understand. She shrugged the jacket back on, covering the insignia that had changed everything. But the knowledge of what lay beneath the fabric would remain with everyone who had witnessed its revelation. The quiet woman they had dismissed and mocked was a member of the most elite military unit in American history, and her presence at Camp Thunder Ridge served purposes that extended far beyond anything they had imagined. As military police vehicles arrived to escort Grant from the field, the desert heat seemed to intensify. But it was nothing compared to the fire that Natasha Williams was about to bring to every aspect of military training doctrine, and the changes that would ripple through the armed forces for years to come. The Ghost Wolves had emerged from the shadows, and nothing would ever be the same. As Major Grant was led away by military police, his career in ruins and his future uncertain, a dangerous undercurrent began to spread through the formation. While most candidates stood in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what they had witnessed, a few individuals were struggling to accept the complete reversal of everything they thought they understood about Natasha Williams. Sergeant Olivia Parker, whose perfectly maintained appearance had always reflected her need for control and order, felt her world tilting on its axis. For weeks, she had built her identity around being superior to the quiet civilian contractor who didn't belong among real warriors. The revelation that Natasha was not only qualified, but carried authority that superseded everyone on the field was a psychological blow that Parker's ego couldn't absorb. "This is insane," Parker muttered to Corporal Ryan Davis, who stood beside her with his own expression of stubborn disbelief. "I don't care what tattoo she's got or what paperwork says. Look at her. Does she look like some elite operative to you?" Davis, whose heavily tattooed arms told the story of conventional military deployments, nodded grimly. "Something doesn't add up," Elite units don't hide their members in civilian contractor positions. They don't send them to basic training facilities. This whole thing feels like some kind of setup. Their whispered conversation was attracting attention from other candidates who were struggling with similar cognitive dissonance. The human mind resists information that contradicts deeply held beliefs, and several people on that field had invested weeks in the narrative that Natasha was weak, unqualified, and undeserving of her position. Private Lauren Murphy, the youngest and most impressionable member of their group, seized on their doubts like a lifeline. "Maybe it's not even a real tattoo," she suggested desperately. "Maybe it's fake, part of some elaborate cover story. Has anyone actually verified that she's who she claims to be?" The speculation was dangerous territory, but Parker was too emotionally invested in her original assessment to back down. She had spent years building her reputation on the ability to identify strength and weakness in military personnel. Admitting that she had been completely wrong about Natasha would undermine everything she believed about her own judgment. "You know what?" Parker said, her voice carrying far enough for others to hear. "I want to see some actual proof. Anyone can get a tattoo. Anyone can have fake documents prepared. But if she's really some elite operative, she should be able to prove it." The comment reached Natasha's ears across the desert heat, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she turned to look directly at the group of doubters. Her movement was subtle, just a slight shift in position, but it carried an unmistakable quality of predatory attention. Several candidates who had been nodding along with Parker's theory suddenly found themselves taking involuntary steps backward. Staff Sergeant Antonio Reyes, who had been watching the development with growing alarm, stepped forward. "Sergeant Parker, I strongly advise you to reconsider whatever you're thinking of doing. This situation is already beyond anything we've ever encountered. Don't make it worse." But Parker was past the point of rational consideration. The humiliation of being wrong, combined with weeks of invested mockery, had created a psychological pressure that demanded resolution. She couldn't accept that the woman she had dismissed as weak was actually more qualified than everyone on the field combined. "No," Parker said, her voice rising with desperate conviction. "I've served 3 combat tours. I've saved lives under fire. I've earned every single thing I've achieved through blood and sacrifice. And I'm supposed to just accept that she's better than all of us because of some tattoo and paperwork that nobody can verify." Parker began walking toward Natasha with the kind of determined stride that suggested confrontation was inevitable. Behind her, Davis and Murphy followed, their own doubts and wounded pride overriding their better judgment. Around the field, people began to realize that the day's drama was far from over. General Carter, who had been conferring with his staff about containment protocols, noticed the developing situation and turned his attention back to the formation. His expression darkened as he recognized the dangerous dynamics at play. Military discipline existed specifically to prevent this kind of challenge to authority, but the unusual circumstances had created a situation where normal hierarchies were unclear to many participants. "Sergeant Parker," Carter called out sharply, "return to your position immediately." But Parker was beyond responding to normal command authority. She had crossed a psychological line where admitting error felt more dangerous than continued confrontation. She stopped directly in front of Natasha, close enough to violate personal space in a way that was clearly intended as intimidation. "I want to see proof," Parker demanded, her voice carrying across the silent field. "Real proof, not just tattoos and classified paperwork that conveniently can't be verified. If you're really some elite operative, prove it. Show us what makes you so special." Natasha regarded Parker with the same calm attention she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. But there was something different in her eyes now, a flicker of calculation that suggested she was evaluating threat levels. and response options with the kind of professional assessment that came from years of training in situations where mistakes could be fatal. "Sergeant Parker," Natasha said quietly, her voice carrying despite its low volume, "you should carefully consider whether you really want me to demonstrate my qualifications." The warning was delivered with such understated precision that it sent chills through everyone within hearing range. It wasn't a threat. It was a professional assessment delivered with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of and preferred not to have to prove it. But Parker, driven by wounded pride and desperate need to be right, made the worst possible decision. She reached out to grab Natasha's shoulder, intending to physically demonstrate her dominance over someone she still couldn't accept as superior. Natasha moved. The sequence of events that followed happened so quickly that most observers missed the actual mechanics of what occurred. One moment, Parker was reaching for Natasha's shoulder with aggressive intent. The next, she was face down in the desert sand with her arm twisted behind her back at an angle that made several people wince. In sympathetic pain, the technique was flawless, a textbook example of defensive response that used Parker's own momentum against her. Natasha had redirected the aggressive movement, controlled the descent to prevent serious injury, and established a restraint hold that neutralized any further threat. The entire sequence took perhaps 2 seconds and demonstrated a level of tactical skill that went far beyond standard military training. Parker groaned and tried to push herself up, but something in her shoulder wasn't working correctly. The sound she made was part pain, part shock, and part the dawning realization that she had just physically assaulted a federal operative in front of hundreds of witnesses and multiple commanding officers. Natasha released the hold and stepped back, brushing desert sand from her hands. Her breathing hadn't changed, her composure remained intact, and her expression showed nothing more than mild professional satisfaction at having resolved a potential threat efficiently and with minimal force. "Medics," General Carter called out, gesturing toward Parker. Then he turned his attention to the wider formation, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command authority. "Does anyone else have questions about Operative Williams's qualifications?" The field had gone so quiet that the only sounds were the distant rumble of vehicles and the soft whisper of desert wind through the equipment structures. Parker's challenge had been answered definitively, and the demonstration of Natasha's capabilities left no room for further doubt about her training or competence. But the consequences of the day's events were still unfolding, and several careers were about to be destroyed by the poor decisions that wounded pride and cognitive dissonance had produced. The desert heat seemed to intensify as the full weight of the afternoon's events began to settle over Camp Thunder Ridge. What had started as a routine training day had escalated into a career-ending catastrophe for multiple personnel, and the ripple effects were spreading through the military hierarchy at light speed. Sergeant Olivia Parker lay in the sand, her shoulder throbbing with pain that served as a physical reminder of how catastrophically she had misjudged the situation. As medics attended to her injury, she could hear the urgent radio chatter that indicated her assault on a federal operative was being reported to authorities far beyond the training facility. The pristine reputation she had spent years building was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Sergeant Parker," Colonel Patricia Hayes said, her voice carrying the formal tone that accompanied serious military legal proceedings. "You are being placed under immediate arrest for assault on a classified operative, insubordination, and potential violations of federal security statutes. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly advise you to exercise that right until you have legal representation." Parker tried to speak, to explain that she had been trying to protect the integrity of the program, but Hayes's raised hand cut her off. "Sergeant, anything you say will be documented and used in both military and civilian legal proceedings. Your best option at this point is complete silence." The formal arrest procedures unfolding in front of 300 witnesses served as a stark demonstration of how seriously the military treated assaults on special operations personnel. Parker's combat record, her years of distinguished service, her previous commendations, none of it would matter now. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and the consequences would follow her for the rest of her life. Corporal Ryan Davis, who had encouraged Parker's confrontation and supported her challenge to Natasha's credentials, found himself facing his own reckoning. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson approached him with a tablet computer containing Davis's complete service record, social media history, and every communication he had made while at Camp Thunder Ridge. "Corporal Davis," Thompson said, his voice professionally neutral but carrying undertones that suggested serious consequences. "Our investigation shows that you have spent the past 4 weeks actively undermining unit cohesion through harassment of a classified operative. You've created and shared disparaging content about Operative Williams, encouraged others to question her legitimacy, and participated in coordinated efforts to make her feel unwelcome." Davis's heavily tattooed arms, which had always been a source of pride as they chronicled his military service, now seemed to mock him as symbols of achievements that were about to be stripped away. "Sir, I didn't know she was classified. Her file didn't show." "Corporal," Thompson interrupted, "your security clearance required you to understand that some information operates on a need-to-know basis. Your failure to recognize that possibility, combined with your active participation in harassment, demonstrates a fundamental lack of judgment that makes you unsuitable for continued military service." The words carried the weight of career termination. Davis could see his future collapsing. His security clearance would be revoked. His discharge would be less than honorable, and his prospects for civilian employment in any security-related field would be destroyed. The veteran benefits he had earned through years of service were now at risk because of his refusal to accept that appearances could be deceiving. Private Lauren Murphy, the youngest member of the group and the one who had suggested that Natasha's credentials might be fake, watched in horror as her role models faced the consequences of decisions she had supported and encouraged. At 22, Murphy had thought she was learning about military culture from experienced veterans who knew how to identify weakness and strength in their fellow soldiers. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the JAG officer, approached Murphy with a different demeanor than she had used with Parker and Davis. "Private Murphy, your age and relative inexperience may be mitigating factors in the disciplinary proceedings you're facing. However, your participation in harassment of a classified operative, your role in spreading false information about her credentials, and your failure to maintain professional military bearing will result in administrative action." Murphy's voice cracked as she tried to respond. "Ma'am, I was just following their lead. I thought they knew what they were talking about." "Private," Mitchell said with something approaching sympathy, "military service requires independent judgment, not blind following of poor examples. Your actions over the past 4 weeks demonstrate that you're not ready for the responsibilities that come with elite military training." While the individual disciplinary actions were being processed, General Carter was dealing with larger systemic issues. The exposure of a Ghost Wolves operative had created security concerns that extended far beyond Camp Thunder Ridge. Every person who had witnessed the afternoon's events now possessed classified information that could compromise ongoing operations if improperly disclosed. "General," Colonel Hayes reported, "we're implementing Information Security Protocol 7 for all personnel present during the incident. Non-disclosure agreements are being updated with specific language regarding today's events, and all electronic devices used to record any portion of the confrontation are being confiscated for security review." Carter nodded grimly. The administrative burden of containing the security breach would be enormous, but it was necessary to protect operations that involve national security at the highest levels. "What's the timeline for completing the documentation?" "Sir, given the number of witnesses and the complexity of the classification issues involved, We're looking at approximately 72 hours to complete initial containment protocols. Full security review and clearance updates could take several weeks. Meanwhile, Natasha herself had become the center of a different kind of attention. Officers who had never heard of the Ghost Wolves were receiving emergency briefings about the unit's history, mission parameters, and the authority carried by its members. Staff Sergeant Antonio Reyes, who had tried to warn his colleagues against confronting Natasha, found himself being questioned about his knowledge of classified operations. "Staff Sergeant," Captain Mitchell asked, "how did you recognize the significance of Operative Williams's tattoo?" Reyes chose his words carefully. "Ma'am, during my deployments, I encountered references to various special operations units. The Ghost Wolves insignia was mentioned in classified briefings as a symbol that field personnel might encounter. We were instructed to provide complete cooperation to anyone bearing that designation." The revelation that some personnel had known about Ghost Wolves operations but hadn't recognized Natasha's connection to them raised additional questions about communication failures within the military intelligence system. How many other classified operatives were working in positions where their true status wasn't recognized by local command? As the afternoon wore on, the scope of the career damage became clear. Major Grant faced court-martial proceedings that could result in federal prison time. Sergeant Parker would be dishonorably discharged and faced potential civilian prosecution for assault. Corporal Davis was looking at administrative discharge with loss of benefits. Private Murphy would be transferred out of elite training and face disciplinary action that would limit her future military opportunities. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the complete transformation of how Natasha Williams was perceived and treated within the military hierarchy. Officers who had ignored her for weeks were now approaching with respectful requests for consultation. Instructors who had dismissed her quiet competence were requesting her input on training protocols. The woman who had been ordered to strip in public humiliation was now being asked to review and improve the very programs that had failed to recognize her value. The Ghost Wolves tattoo, which had been hidden beneath regulation uniforms for 3 years, had finally served its purpose. Not as a symbol of personal achievement, but as a catalyst for change that would ripple through military training doctrine for years to come. The question now was whether the institution that had failed to recognize Natasha's worth was ready to learn from its mistakes and implement the changes necessary to prevent such failures in the future. The desert sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, but the heat of the day's consequences would continue burning long after darkness fell over Camp Thunder Ridge. Within 48 hours of the confrontation that had exposed Natasha Williams as a Ghost Wolves operative, Camp Thunder Ridge was operating under entirely new protocols. The transformation wasn't gradual or bureaucratic. It was swift, decisive, and implemented with the kind of authority that came directly from the Pentagon's highest levels. General Carter stood in his office, reviewing orders that had arrived via encrypted communication channels he rarely accessed. The documents bore signatures and authorization codes that represented command authority extending well beyond his own considerable rank. Natasha Williams was being officially appointed as Director of Advanced Tactical Training Development, a position that carried authority to revise, update, and completely restructure military training protocols across all branches of the armed forces. "Sir," Captain Derek Sullivan said, entering the office with his own set of orders, "I've just received instructions to provide Operative Williams with complete access to all training materials, evaluation systems, and curriculum development resources. Additionally, she's being granted authority to terminate the participation of any personnel she deems unsuitable for continued training." Carter nodded grimly. The position being created for Natasha was unprecedented in its scope and authority. Most training reforms took months or years to implement through normal military bureaucracy. But the exposure of a classified operative due to Institutional failures had triggered emergency protocols that bypassed standard procedures entirely. "What's her first priority?" Carter asked. "Sir, she's requested a complete review of the psychological evaluation processes used for candidate selection. According to these orders, she believes current protocols are failing to identify personnel with judgment deficiencies that could compromise operational security." The irony wasn't lost on Carter. The same evaluation systems that had approved Major Grant, Sergeant Parker, and their colleagues for elite training had failed to recognize their potential for the kind of catastrophic decision-making that had just destroyed their careers. If Natasha could improve those systems, she might prevent similar incidents from occurring at other facilities. Across the base, word of Natasha's appointment was spreading through official and unofficial channels. Staff Sergeant Antonio Reyes, who had tried to warn his colleagues against confronting her, found himself summoned to an emergency meeting in the base conference room. When he arrived, he discovered Natasha sitting at the head of the table, flanked by Colonel Hayes and Lieutenant Colonel Thompson. "Staff Sergeant Reyes," Natasha said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had always been present, but was now officially recognized. "Your conduct during recent events suggests you possess better judgment than many of your colleagues. I'm offering you a position as my senior training consultant, with authority to implement new evaluation protocols across special operations training programs." Reyes felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The promotion was significant. It would advance his career by years and put him at the forefront of military training development. But it also meant working directly with someone whose true capabilities were still largely unknown to him. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "what would my responsibilities include?" "Staff Sergeant, you'll be helping me identify and eliminate the systemic failures that allowed harassment of classified personnel to continue for weeks without intervention. You'll also assist in developing new training scenarios based on real-world operations rather than theoretical exercises." The mention of real-world operations sent a chill through Reyes. He was beginning to understand that Natasha's knowledge came from experiences that went far beyond standard military training. The quiet woman who had been dismissed as weak-possessed. Operational knowledge that could revolutionize how soldiers were prepared for actual combat. Meanwhile, the candidates who remained in the program were experiencing their own transformation. The removal of Parker, Davis, Murphy, and several others who had participated in harassment had created a different atmosphere entirely. Conversations that had once focused on gossip and speculation now centered on professional development and actual training objectives. Captain Jennifer Logan, who had initially been suspicious of Natasha's background, found herself working directly with the new Director of Advanced Tactical Training Development to revise exercise protocols. "Ma'am," Logan said during their first planning session, "the scenarios you're proposing are unlike anything we've used before. They seem designed to test psychological resilience as much as tactical competence." Natasha looked up from the training manual she was annotating. "Captain Logan, most training failures in real operations occur not because personnel lack physical skills, but because they make poor decisions under psychological pressure. Current training exercises don't adequately prepare soldiers for the mental challenges they'll face in actual combat situations." Logan nodded, beginning to understand the depth of thought behind Natasha's proposed changes. "Are these scenarios based on actual operations?" "They're based on situations where better training could have prevented casualties," Natasha replied simply. The answer was both truthful and deliberately vague, providing enough information to explain the relevance without disclosing classified details. The new training protocols Natasha implemented were revolutionary in their approach. Instead of focusing solely on physical performance and tactical knowledge, they emphasized decision-making under pressure, recognition of deception, and the ability to identify competence regardless of appearances. The changes were designed to prevent exactly the kind of failures in judgment that had nearly destroyed careers and compromised security at Camp Thunder Ridge. One of her first major innovations was the introduction of blind evaluation exercises, where candidates were assessed on their ability to recognize skill and competence without knowing the background or apparent qualifications of the people they were evaluating. Personnel who consistently failed these evaluations, who relied on appearances rather than actual performance, were quietly transferred to positions where their judgment limitations would be less dangerous. The psychological evaluation processes were completely overhauled to identify candidates with the kind of ego-driven decision-making that had led to the confrontation with Natasha. New screening protocols looked for patterns of behavior that suggested personnel might prioritize their own sense of superiority over mission effectiveness or unit cohesion. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The dismissive attitudes and casual harassment that had characterized the program were replaced by professional standards that emphasized respect for all personnel, regardless of their apparent background or qualifications. Natasha made it clear that competence would be recognized and rewarded, while prejudice would be identified and eliminated without exception. "The enemy doesn't care about your preconceptions," she told a group of instructor candidates during one of her first official briefings. "They don't care if you think someone looks weak or strong, familiar or foreign, qualified or unqualified. They care about results. If you can't accurately assess capability when it's standing right in front of you, you're not qualified to train people whose lives depend on making correct judgments." The message was unmistakable. The days of judging personnel based on appearances, background assumptions, or personal biases were over. The new training protocols would prepare soldiers for a world where threats and allies might not look like what they expected, and where survival depended on seeing through deception to identify true capabilities. Within weeks, other military installations were requesting copies of Natasha's revised training materials. The Pentagon was receiving reports of improved performance from units trained under her new protocols. Word was spreading through military circles that something extraordinary was happening at Camp Thunder Ridge, and that the changes being implemented there could transform military effectiveness across all branches of service. The Ghost Wolves insignia remained hidden beneath Natasha's regulation uniform, but its influence was spreading throughout the military establishment. The woman who had been ordered to strip in public humiliation had become the architect of a new approach to military training, one that recognized that true strength often came disguised as something else entirely. 2 years after the confrontation that changed everything at Camp Thunder Ridge, Natasha Williams stood before a congressional committee, presenting her annual report on military training effectiveness. The statistics were impressive enough to command attention from even the most skeptical lawmakers. Casualty rates in special operations had decreased by 35%, mission success rates had improved by 42%, and a new generation of military leaders was emerging with demonstrably better judgment under pressure. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real transformation had been cultural. A fundamental shift in how the military identified, developed, and utilized human potential. The woman who had once been dismissed as weak and unqualified had become one of the most influential figures in modern military training doctrine. "Congresswoman Martinez," Natasha said, responding to a question about the program's expansion, "the principles we've implemented at Camp Thunder Ridge are now being adopted by training facilities across all branches of the armed forces. We've demonstrated that when you eliminate bias from evaluation processes and focus purely on demonstrated competence, you discover capabilities that traditional assessment methods consistently miss." Representative Sarah Martinez nodded, consulting her notes. "Director Williams, can you provide specific examples of how these changes have impacted operational effectiveness?" Natasha's response was measured and professional, but those who knew her story could hear the deeper meaning beneath her words. "Congresswoman, we've seen dramatic improvements in unit cohesion. decision-making under pressure, and the ability to recognize threats and assets regardless of their apparent characteristics. Personnel trained under our revised protocols consistently demonstrate better judgment in field situations where appearances can be deliberately deceptive. What she couldn't say in an open congressional hearing was that her training innovations were directly saving lives. Units operating under her protocols were identifying enemy infiltrators more effectively, recognizing friendly assets in unconventional situations, and making tactical decisions based on actual capabilities rather than assumptions derived from stereotypes. The ghost of Operation Silent Thunder lived on in every training manual she revised, every exercise she designed, every evaluation protocol she implemented. The 5 teammates who hadn't made it home were saving lives through the institutional changes. Their sacrifice had inspired Dot in her Pentagon office. Photographs lined the walls showing training facilities from around the world where her methods had been adopted. Letters from commanding officers detailed success stories that couldn't be shared publicly, but demonstrated the life and death importance of her work. A simple framed photograph sat prominently on her desk. 7 people in combat gear, taken the night before a mission that officially never happened. The knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Staff Sergeant Antonio Reyes entered, now promoted to Master Sergeant and serving as her senior training consultant. In his hands was a folder marked with the highest security classifications. "Ma'am, we've received a request from the Joint Chiefs. They want you to review training protocols for a new classified operation." Natasha accepted the folder, noting the familiar weight of responsibility that came with such assignments. "What's the timeline, Antonio?" "They need your recommendations within 72 hours. The operation is scheduled to begin next month." As Reyes left, Natasha opened the folder and began reading. The mission parameters were complex, the risks significant, the potential for casualties high if the team wasn't properly prepared. But she had tools now that hadn't existed during Operation Silent Thunder. Training methods that could identify personnel who would make good decisions under impossible pressure. Evaluation protocols that could spot the kind of judgment failures that had nearly destroyed careers at Camp Thunder Ridge. She picked up her pen and began making notes. Each annotation represented knowledge gained through sacrifice, wisdom earned through loss, improvements that could prevent other families from receiving the kind of phone call that had shattered 5 families 3 years ago. The legend of the confrontation at Camp Thunder Ridge had spread throughout military circles, though the full details remained classified. Stories were told in secure briefing rooms about the quiet woman who had been publicly humiliated only to reveal herself as one of the most elite operatives in American military history. The tale served as a cautionary reminder that appearances could be fatally deceiving, and that true competence often hid beneath unremarkable exteriors. Major Thomas Grant, the officer who had ordered Natasha to strip in front of hundreds of witnesses, had served 8 months in federal prison for his role in compromising classified operations. Upon his release, he'd found employment as a security consultant for a private firm. His military career permanently ended by 15 minutes of catastrophic judgment. In quiet moments, he sometimes wondered what would have happened if he had simply asked Natasha about her background instead of assuming he understood her limitations. Sergeant Olivia Parker had been dishonorably discharged and faced ongoing civil litigation related to her assault on a federal operative. Her perfect makeup and pristine appearance, which had once been symbols of her professional competence, now seemed like mockeries of the assumptions that had destroyed her career. She worked at a retail job in her hometown, her military benefits lost, her security clearance permanently revoked. Corporal Ryan Davis and Private Lauren Murphy had both been discharged with administrative separations that effectively ended their military careers. Davis found work in construction, his combat Tattoos now serving as reminders of opportunities lost rather than achievements earned. Murphy had returned to college, hoping to rebuild a future that no longer included the military service she had once seen as her calling. But the most significant legacy of that desert afternoon wasn't the destruction of individual careers. It was the institutional transformation that had emerged from their failure. Military training facilities around the world now operated under protocols that prioritized actual competence over apparent qualifications, that recognized strength regardless of how it was packaged, and that understood the fatal danger of judging capability by appearance. The Ghost Wolves tattoo remained hidden beneath regulation uniforms, but its influence had spread throughout the military establishment. Training manuals incorporated lessons learned from classified operations. Evaluation protocols identified and eliminated the kind of bias that had nearly compromised national security. A new generation of military leaders was emerging with the understanding that true warriors came in many forms, and that the most dangerous operatives were often those who looked least dangerous. As evening fell over Washington, D.C., Natasha continued, working on the classified training protocols that would prepare the next generation of special operations personnel. Each revision represented a life potentially saved, a mission that might succeed because someone had learned to see past appearances to identify real capability. The quiet woman who had been ordered to strip in the desert heat had become a guardian of military effectiveness, ensuring that future generations would be trained to recognize competence wherever it appeared. The shadow of Operation Silent Thunder had been transformed into a light that would guide military training for decades to come, and the sacrifice of 5 ghost wolves would continue protecting American lives long after their names had been classified. Beyond recognition. In the end, the greatest victories were won not by those who looked like warriors, but by those who had earned the right to be warriors, whether anyone recognized them or not. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.